Kim, what's on your radar?
Well, do you remember the Great Barrington Declaration? Back in October of 2020, a year ago, 3 well-respected epidemiologists and public health scientists, Sunetra Gupta of Oxford, Jay Bhattacharya of Stanford, and Martin Kulldorff of Harvard, wrote a memo detailing what they believed would be a better approach to handling the pandemic. And if you remember, during that time, everyone was still all about the lockdowns. The common wisdom of the day was stay home, save lives, and wait for a vaccine. Schools closed, businesses were shuttered, people were scrambling to figure out how they were going to make ends meet, holiday parties were canceled, families were told to keep gatherings to a minimum. Our lives were totally upended. Worried people who called for the economy to open back up were labeled selfish grandma killers, or they were told they were in the pockets of Wall Street, caring only about profits. But the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration said this is going to end in disaster. The consequences of these lockdowns are going to be disastrous. They said, quote, current lockdown policies are producing devastating effects on short and long-term public health. The results, to name a few, include lower childhood vaccination rates, worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes, fewer cancer screenings, and deteriorating mental health, leading to greater excess mortality in years to come, with the working class and younger members of society carrying the heaviest burden. Keeping students out of school is a grave injustice. They went on to say that a more measured way of doing this, a more compassionate way, is to allow extremely low-risk youth, our children, college students, and the younger workforce to live life as normal. Let them go back to work. Let them go back to school. Let them even socialize and have a good time. The authors argued there's no reason to shut them down and force them to live in isolation when they are at extremely low risk of severe COVID outcomes. Protect the high risk and let the rest go about their lives, and even perhaps achieve herd immunity. This was met with intense backlash. Even though thousands of scientists have gone on to sign the declaration, many others disagreed, claiming the strategy was dangerous, irresponsible, and not backed by science. So let's fast forward, because it's now been a year. Were they wrong? Did the lockdown save lives without devastating consequences, or were these 3 authors unfortunately right? Well, let's start with lower vaccination rates. The authors mentioned children will not have access to the regular childhood vaccination schedule if we keep them out of schools. Documents from a recent Maryland State Board of Education meeting show that just in the state of Maryland alone, 23,000 children did not get their regularly scheduled vaccines this year. They compared that number to the year before, when it was only 62. Yeah, 62 kids compared to 23,000 in 1 year's time who've missed their vaccines for diseases that actually affect them. So take a look at this NPR article published on Tuesday. ERs are now swamped with seriously ill patients, but many don't even have COVID. Quote, even in parts of the country where COVID-19 isn't overwhelming the health system, patients are showing up to the ER sicker than they were before the pandemic. Their disease is more advanced and in need of more complicated care. Months of treatment delays have exacerbated chronic conditions and worsened symptoms. Doctors and nurses say the severity of illness ranges widely and includes abdominal pain, respiratory problems, blood clots, heart conditions, and suicide attempts, amongst others. So this sounds a whole lot like what the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration warned us about, claiming we'd see worsening cardiovascular disease outcomes, fewer cancer screenings, and deteriorating mental health. Now, what's extremely concerning is the massive mental health crisis the nation is now seeing in our children. Pediatric groups are urging lawmakers to treat the crisis as an emergency, citing alarming statistics. Mental health ER visits for children ages 5 through 11 rose by 24%, 31% for children ages 12 through 17, and there's been more than a 50% increase in emergency room visits for suspected suicide attempts amongst girls between the ages of 12 through 17. So things are bad. And the social isolation, anxiety, fear, and staying away from each other when we've needed each other most has clearly led to serious outcomes. When people needed to see their doctors, they were either too frightened to venture out, or in many cases, the doctor's offices themselves were closed down. Now we're seeing increased rates of advanced diseases that are harder to treat, and these are in younger people, people who have a very low risk of dying from COVID. We locked down, claiming it was for the greater good, and demonized people who sounded the alarm. And now people are dying from advanced cancer and heart disease they weren't able to get diagnosed during the lockdowns. Now they're suffering from mental health disorders and attempting to take their own lives. Now children who aren't really at risk of COVID may catch measles from a lack of vaccination. So it turns out a year later, after these three prestigious and well-respected public health scientists have been villainized, they were right. The lockdowns proved to be a disaster with devastating consequences. Consequences for younger people who are often at little to no risk of severe COVID. And I'm only scratching the surface. The list of the consequences is much longer than I have time for here. Some people might say, yeah, but the lockdowns did at least slow the spread and help prevent hospitals from being overwhelmed. Well, after examining 80 studies on lockdowns from around the world, Simon Fraser University economics professor Douglas W. Allen concluded that only 20 of the 80 studies showed a positive benefit in slowing the spread, and even then, it was minor. He went on to say, quote, "It is possible that lockdowns will go down as one of the greatest peacetime policy failures in Canada's history." Well, it turns out, not just in Canada's history, but in ours here in the U.S. as well. And from the various reports coming from the UK and other European lockdown nations, there's also. It's possible that lockdowns will go down as one of the greatest peacetime policy failures in history, period. So I want to bring up that these scientists, these three that wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, which has, by the way, been signed by nearly 1 million other health professionals and scientists, they're now sounding a different alarm. Now that we're kind of out of lockdowns, I mean, there's a possibility we always go back into them. But the alarm that they've been lately sounding is on natural immunity. You know, they're wondering, why are we having all of these mandates that don't allow for the exemption of natural immunity? We're ignoring natural immunity, and that could be potentially with more devastating consequences for people and for the economy. And I'm just wondering, you know, now we see a year later that these lockdowns absolutely were a major failure in a lot of ways for a lot of young people. Are we going to listen to these scientists now? Are we going to continue to villainize them and say, oh, no, you guys don't know what you're talking about?
And what happens next time there's some kind of public crisis? We've now just normalized the idea that if anything is going wrong, no, it's fine to force all businesses to close. It's fine to shut down all schools for an unlimited, indefinite period of time. If we're going based on the level of risk that is acceptable to the CDC, then we will have calamitous economy and culture and mental health ruining interventions. This wasn't the drop of a hat, but next time I worry it could be even a much smaller level event crisis, and you might see the same policy result because now we just normalize that this is what we do.
Yeah, and I think these guys were right about some things and wrong about others. And I think that the way that they shut down schools in such an extreme way was deeply wrong, was harmful to a lot of children. I believe that so strongly. We actually moved out of Washington, D.C. to a place where you could put your kids in school. On the other hand, these guys were so extreme, and their extremism was based on a faulty understanding of the pandemic. In March 2020, one of the three authors took to the Wall Street Journal famously and said, they're blowing this out of proportion. A better estimate of the fatalities that we're going to see from COVID are around 20,000 to 40,000. Well, we've seen 20,000 since September. Mm-hmm. We've seen 700,000+ people die in the United States. In the very beginning, public health officials were saying, if you don't do anything, if we don't socially distance, if we don't mask up, if we don't take this seriously, there could be 2 to 4 million people who die. They mocked that. So it was taken seriously in a lot of places, social distancing. So we're under 1 million. If we hadn't, we could be at the 2 to 4 million range. And so the problem I have with this conversation is that because it's so polarized, there's never any accountability for people getting things wrong if they're on your side. Like if Fauci came out,
which goes both ways.
Absolutely goes both ways. It absolutely goes
because there
both
were
ways.
a lot. You're right. Their projections were wrong, but there were bad projections going too far the other way. Basically, everyone except that you guy whose projections were really good. I don't know if you followed him on Twitter.
No,
that's the expert. Listen to that guy. He got it right. But yes.
Yeah, I mean, the reason we even went into lockdowns, we remember, was because of Niall Ferguson's, his predictions, which was going to be just here in the United States alone, 2 to 3 million people dying. And really throughout the pandemic, we've seen that the age of the people and the people that are most affected with severe COVID outcomes hasn't changed throughout this, even with the Delta variant and now even with Delta Plus variant that they're seeing in the UK and in Israel. They're showing that it's still the same group of people, which is that really elderly group over 65. And a lot of the policies that we have been enacting, even with vaccine mandates for workers, which is, it's like, well, the people that are actually ending up in the hospital, they're filling up the hospitals and that are ending up with these severe outcomes are people that are retired already. I mean, they don't have to listen to anybody anymore, right? So there's a lot of things that we probably could be doing even now as we're still working our way through this that is more focused on where the actual risk is. And I think that is ultimately what these guys were calling for. A lot of the world did not go into lockdown. This was something that was more focused on the West. South America did, several places in South America did as well. But, it's interesting to look at now the outcomes based on the different policies that different countries did throughout. So,
well, thank you, Kim. Stay tuned, everybody. We'll have more Rising when we're back in just a minute.